Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 30th of November. In today's upload, we're going to be rather concise in relation to yesterday. In yesterday's video, we discussed really comprehensive frontline updates, but also appointments made to the Ukrainian High Command and potential restructuring that will occur over the next couple of weeks. So if you guys are interested in that, then watch the end of my last video. But today it's going to be just a brief update looking at changes spanning from Velyka Novosilka to Pokrovsk. And going forward, if there is enough popular demand, then I do want to look at the events unfolding in Syria with the clashes going on east of Aleppo, for instance, or just north of Hama. Those two cities are, of course, right now at the epicenter of the fighting between the HTS and the SNA. So those are the rebel-backed forces in Syria against the Syrian government and the various militia groups that are supporting it. So if you guys are interested in, delving deep into that, then I could of course do that, but I just need to know if enough of you guys are interested in watching that sort of content. But in any case, I want to begin by looking east of Velyka Novosilka, where once again we have proof from the Ukrainian side admitting this that the Russians have chipped away at additional fields that are acting as a buffer between the Russian line of contact and the Mokry River Valley. Over here, you can see southeast of Velyka Novosilka. This is an area where we've seen less of a Russian emphasis on pushing forward, but now they're beginning to consolidate control over large-scale open fields, areas that the Ukrainians simply cannot hold on to. There are not static defenses in this region. Hence, it becomes rather easy for the Russians to come in with a singular column of armored vehicles, dismount troops in one specific tree line, and then by virtue of that, the Ukrainians have no way to defend anything else in the vicinity. So here you can see the Russians taking over nearly 11 square kilometers southeast of Velyka Novosilka, amounting to an advance of a total of, let's say, 3.5 kilometers westwards. And this is important because now a lot of the depth that the Ukrainians have that is between what previously was the line of contact and the Mokry River is being taken away, meaning that there's not only the fear of direct Russian infiltrations into the city itself, but also southwards. There is a possibility of reaching this road, the road that leads from the front line near Oruzhenia, Starmayorsk, and Blaudatnya into Velyka Novosilka from the south, another entrance to the city that could be taken over by the Russians and that could disrupt the frontline connectivity for the current Ukrainian companies and squads that are defending at the head of areas like Makarivka or Storozheve, meaning that the Russian operation that is currently unfolding east of Velyka Novosilka could also have the implication of leading to the fall of other villages that are nearby, but maybe on the other side of the Mokry riverbank to the west. And those could also be caught in the crossfire and taken over by the Russian side due to these pushes that are coming in from this new axis. And I believe that a lot of this is being done by the 37th Motor Rifle Brigade because recently we've seen them reintroduced into the fighting after a sort of lull period where we saw less public reporting on their movements, but now they may be involved in this push located to the southeast of the city that could be threatening for the local positions of small squads from the presidential brigade, including the 3rd and 20th battalions that should be holding out in these yellow markers over here. Besides that, there really is a lack of any strong points to fall back to. And same thing goes for the area north of the city. Here, the Russians advanced nearly 8 square kilometers, and once again, very, very close to the highway that leads from the north. We've talked about this now at the beginning of every single video for the past couple of weeks, from Bakhatir to Stepna Street over here. So it's important to note that the Ukrainians are trying to build a defense line along this road, but of course that means that it's going to be at the epicenter of fighting, and so any transport through there is very, very possible, if not impossible at this point, I should say. Meaning that most of the supplies are coming in from the west, which would be connecting it to Zaporozhye and then also to some of the areas in southern Dnipro, and then moving from there eastwards. But again, an issue is that this road is only about 3.5 kilometers away from where the Russians are currently located in Rivnopil in Novodarivka. So even there are issues. And then the other route that's being utilized is via Komar and then southwards along the river bank into Velyka Novosilka, also relatively close to the front line when you're measuring it, only about 4 kilometers. So in either case, the Ukrainians really are lacking in a buffer zone. They are coming under direct fire from every single available means of firepower, even sometimes small arms fire when it comes to this road here. So the Ukrainians are trying to build up a defense line around the stronghold and in the accompanying open fields. But you have the 40th Naval Infantry Brigade and the 5th Tank Brigade that are continuing to push in this region. At the same time, you have the push south of Kostiantynopolsk, leading to the capture of 1.2 square kilometers of territory. And again, this is a part of an earlier Russian assault that occurred yesterday that we discussed. We had the geolocation from November 29th to back it up. This is due to the 37th Marine Brigade releasing their own footage showing how they repelled a Russian column. And then the second one was able to dismount forces and take over a local stronghold that the Ukrainians held on to just northwest of Kurakhove. So now we just have additional confirmation from the Ukrainian side that the majority of the strong point has been really taken over by the Russians, in addition to some open fields that, if you're measuring it now, are only about 1 kilometer away from the village itself and about nearly 1.75 kilometers away from the Sukhiyali River. And that's extremely concerning because reaching that riverbank will put any Ukrainian positions in western Yelizavetivka, Veselihai, Haninivka, Uspenivka in grave danger of being encircled, not just because of the distance between the Sukhiyali River to the northern ring of the Ukrainian corridor holding onto this pocket, but also because having the river, having the Ukrainians having to defend with their backs against a river makes it much more difficult for them to eventually withdraw. They're going to have to deal with a physical obstacle while they're leaving their positions at some point. And so the Ukrainians, despite that fact, they are really unwavering in their resistance as they're trying to hold out in every single feasible field, strong point, house, basement, whatever it may be, in order to drag out the fighting in an area that is really, really deep into the line of contact and disconnected, you could say, from where the Russians are trying to move the fighting towards a new epicenter that would be around even west of Kurakhove towards Andrivka. So that's really the goal over here, to buy time for the Ukrainians in Andrivka. Because as long as you have these Ukrainians that are defending several battalions strong within the Uspenivka pockets, that's going to be the Russian priority, to squeeze them out, to ensure that it's no longer an issue on their flanks, that the Russians can then utilize those roads and those various heights that are located adjacent to the pockets to their advantage. And then as a result, the Russians are not focusing and putting as much gas into fighting located directly south of Andrivka. So that's the Ukrainian calculus, even though it is a risk, but it's something that they really are willing to take a bet on, and that they've sent in reinforcements in order to do, as we saw with the 37th Marine Brigade, as just one example. And actually, the 37th Marine Brigade has its Hydra units, or rather, I meant to say that the 137th Marine Battalion is operating further to the north, but also generally around the Andrivka sector, in that it employs the Hydra unit, which we'll get into in a second when looking at some additional Russian advances. But just to zoom in over here and recalibrate, you can see that the Russians have taken over the entirety of Ilinka. This is based on footage showing the Russian capture of the western side of the village by the 33rd Motor Rifle Regiment. They entered in with armored vehicles. The armored vehicles provided fire support. There were also some tanks involved, firing directly into the Ukrainian holdouts that were very close to the Sukhiyali River. FPV drones were employed to strike Ukrainians during their withdrawal towards Romanivka, and also trying to withdraw from certain areas of Yelizavetivka, which is still under fierce contention and battle right now. But again, the Russians were able to clear out the houses individually here and then raise their flag in one of the streets, which was geolocated today, indicating full capture. Now the Russians have a direct route, not just to Romanivka, but then also to the remaining villages, a part of this pocket, which continues to shrink in size as really the region in the area where the Russians have made the most gains within this pocket has been through direct contact and direct fighting, clearing out house by house, even though that's the most costly and really grinds down both the attacker and the defender. It's also the region where the Russians have been able to yield the most gains. When you look at the flanks, the north or the south, the Ukrainians have put an emphasis on trying to hold on to them, at the very least maintaining this sort of 4 to 5 kilometer wide. Now it's been reduced to 3.3 kilometer wide corridor in order to provide a lifeline for its forces in this region. In any case, I want to look here at Kurakhove, where we see additional advances marked by the Ukrainian side. Again, we're not looking at square kilometers worth of territory being captured, but it is a relatively substantial portion of the city being captured within a day or two. So it is really important to note. So when you're looking at the areas captured by the Russians, it's mainly in the eastern central portion of Kurakhove. That's how I would describe it, because you have the eastern section, which is sort of cut off from the rest of the city based on this floodplain, And this area is more rural in nature. It's not a rural village or anything like that, but it's just like private residential buildings, gardens, a lot of shrubbery, and then also some agricultural centers. So all of that was taken over by the Russians. The Russians then utilized the two bridges over here, or not bridges, but just roads and the floodplains to cross over. And they created a very, very substantial spearhead in one particular area where there was just a lack of Ukrainian defensive depth. And you could see it over here advancing about 1.5 kilometers westwards, solidifying themselves in a very particular apartment location, barricading themselves as a result to prevent the Ukrainians from successfully firing upon them and conducting a localized counterattack. And since then, since November 25th, for 5 days, they've been able to hold on and retain those positions. And with every day that goes on, the Ukrainians are unable to quell the, this growing sort of movement within the city itself, very, very deep into it. It really emboldens the Russian forces, allows them to send in reinforcements and then expand the flanks. And now it's going to be the genesis for a blossoming of the Russian sort of expansion in this particular region. So you can see that with the yellow polygon, recent Russian gains have expanded past the initial sort of breakthrough location. And you could see how several of these high-rise apartment buildings have been taken over by the Russian side. Now they're beginning to infiltrate into local stores, restaurants, various utilities. There's a few local schools over here that have also been captured by the Russian side. You could see the most notable one being school number 5. This is a major high school, and you can see how it just has this large structure that can be employed for either side to, operate in, stay in overnight, and hide from drones, as an example. As a result of this really important advance along Prospect, I think this is Prospect Avenue. This one may be Prospect Avenue, but there's a few various streets here that are also called Prospect. And in this case, they advanced along the road to the south, but also to the north, they advanced along a road called Prospect. So in between, you have a bunch of just private residential areas as well that are separated by gardens. A lot of them now are either in a gray zone or under Russian control due to the Ukrainians just not having the defensive positions over here or cohesiveness to hold on following the surprise of the Russian gains that are located a bit further to the south. And as a result, the Russians have not been able to fill the void and get control over a large chunk of what I referred to previously as the eastern central parts of Kurakhove. And this is also a relatively easy place to take over in a vacuum, such as what we're seeing right now, in comparison to the western portion of Kurakhove, which will be more difficult. Right now, the fighting is also sort of centered around the green elevator located over here and a few other industrial centers. As you go further west, there's also infrastructure associated with the local courthouse and probably some fishing facilities, also the power station as you go further and further west. So when it comes to the areas that are going to be the most difficult for the Russians to get control over, because now we're reaching the stage where they're going to be able to solidify full capture of this portion of the city, which would be about half of it. But the half that is easier to capture just due to the structures being smaller. And then as a result, there are opportunities for the Russians to, find a weak point and exploit that. It's going to be more difficult to do that, all else being equal, which it might not be, with these apartment buildings over here. Just massive apartment complexes, concrete slabs on the facade of the facilities. You have the city hospital over here as well. Local facilities to the north, and then it extends even further westwards, as you're going to see over here on the map, into the power station region and all of the associated mechanical plants. So those regions are going to be very critical for the Ukrainians in the sense that they're going to try to drag out their feet there and buy time for the direct defensive buildup that should be occurring right now, both south and east of Andrivka. So that would be the hope for the Ukrainians to use Kurakhove as a ploy to drag out the fighting for at least a couple of weeks or 1 or 2 months here. And then also in Pivdenie, this is another region where you have several of these large-scale apartment complexes that have to be captured by the Russian side, but it is also currently being isolated due to the Russian advance to the north. You have this sort of localized push by the Russians, which is severing the physical tie between whatever Ukrainian troops are defending in this apartment complex and the ones that are left in the larger facilities to the north. And then you also have a few remaining Ukrainian squads located even further south of Kurakhove in the 2015 to 2022 trenches and in the open fields. But again, their relevance is beginning to wane, and the Russians do have the possibility of eventually evaporating any sort of Ukrainian presence in those areas. So again, very important to see as the Russians continue moving deeper and deeper into Kurakhove and also continue to bombard the western portion. That's a big part of this. They're going to have to try to destroy as much of those structures as possible before they have to, attack them head on the ground. Looking here at the Pokrovsk front to finish off, you're going to see that according to Ukrainian sources, the Russians gained 1.4 square kilometers west of Pushkina. Pushkina is in a very difficult situation as the hamlet it really just consists of two roads and a few houses. And it is very disconnected from the wider Ukrainian defensive structure because that would be about 4 kilometers away from Novosilka. And then once you reach the highway that connects between, as you'll see over here, Andrivka and Pokrovsk, then you actually do have a sort of not necessarily solid line, but it is an area that would be logical to deduce that the Ukrainians could withdraw and reorganize around there. And that includes Novosilka and Ukrainka, and then further westwards, various assortment of other villages. But Pushkina is not a part of that. It is simply a village left on its own that the Russians now have the ability to quickly take over to ensure that they can continue advancing westwards towards the next Ukrainian potential line of defense. So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the Russians get control over additional fields, and these regions are not that well fortified. You don't see many trenches here. And during that time period, Ukrainians don't have that much infantry that's fighting face to face in these fields, in these tree lines at this present moment. A lot of the defense is being organized by the drone crews. The drone crews, they are complaining that they have to directly repel Russian assaults as they're going on live, trying to find Russian soldiers as they're advancing and picking them off. And that's not always been imagined to be the main task of the FPV drone crews. A lot of time, their task was to go into like a static Russian position that is a couple of kilometers away from the front line, not necessarily when the Russians are on the go, and to target the soldiers over there. But now they're also being tasked with filling the defensive roles that infantry should have when they're supposed to be manning trenches and fighting within house to house combats in an area like Pushkina. The village simply is too small and isolated. I don't know how the supply situation really is for the forces over here because of the extreme difficulty of moving heavy equipment, even moving something small like a pickup truck or a civilian vehicle across. Doing so in an open area like this, where the Russian surveillance is also around in the skies, is difficult. I suppose the silver lining is that there has been a relative decline in the amount of cab strikes by the Russian side over the past couple of days, and it could have something to do with the decision to allow the Ukrainians to utilize the TACMs and other long-range missiles onto Russian territory. That's something that has to be investigated further, whether that led to damage to Russian stockpiles that in the immediate term, I'm not talking about long term, but just for the very short term couple of weeks right now, has led the Russians to sort of ration their cabs, and now they're going to just use them maybe say 40% less than they would have a couple of weeks ago. That's definitely a possibility that has to be explored. I just haven't seen it discussed that much, throwing it out there. But in any case, the Russians are still, a formidable threat when it comes to their firepower. Also, when it comes to artillery in this region. Also, here looking a bit to the north, the Russians captured 4.5 square kilometers of territory, including the entirety of Pustynka, which really did not succeed in holding out. These villages are just so small, and the Ukrainians have already been in a spiral for several months, withdrawing from Selidove, then from the suburbs along the Solona River Valley and the rail line, including the Vishneve region, all the way westwards to Zovte. So it's completely understandable why they would not be able to put up a stand in Pustinka, even if they were able to drag out the fighting in the village itself. The flanks are already gone because southwards you already have the push to Pushkina, and the Russians are already gaining along the rail line to Zovteve. So there's really no reason to hold on to Pustinka at this point, no ability to do so either. So the Russians captured that village. They captured the entirety of Zhovte, which means that they are now going to be able to continue with their push westwards. This time towards areas like Novopustinka and Novotroitska, have an opportunity to cut off the highway between Pokrovsk and Kurakhove to finally reach the third to last layer of defense of Pokrovsk, and that is centered around Shevchenko in this particular region. As I said in my last video, Shevchenko is only about 1.8 kilometers away from the front line. And unlocking that, getting control over such a large village would be a huge test for the Russians to prove that they're not just able to take over hamlets, but take over a prepared area with Ukrainian defenses that have been built up over the past couple of months. And if they're able to do so, they really would have this route along the rail line open for them. this route along the rail line. You can see how it pushes directly into the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk and really reaches an area from the rear that the Ukrainians have not really prepared as the main defensive front. They've spent a very long period of time defending eastern entrances to Mirnorod and Pokrovsk, and not necessarily the southern front, even though they do have some units here that have recently been moved in that are very active with the defensive activities. And also, of course, have trenches in these regions. It's just not as well built as the area to the east. So now the focus is going to have to shift as the immediate threat is along this region. And even if the Ukrainians are able to create a sort of stabilized line for the next couple of weeks between Lysivka and Shevchenko, it is still concerning in the sense that now the Russians have been able to open up a new front to threaten Pokrovsk. So it's not just going to be from the east that they're going to have to defend it and worry about, holding on to territory, but it's also going to have to be from the south, which will further, distract the Ukrainian forces and further degrade their defensive capacity in the medium range term when it comes to the defense of this really, really important city. And the Ukrainians really are banking on holding on to here for an extended period of time. Not the same thing as what's going on in an area like Kurakhove by any means. They really are trying to dig in substantially within the Pokrovsk really perimeter in general. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.